Want to let everyone know we will be hosting another event on Thursday the 28th with Trioni Wines out of Napa. So that will be coming up. So pay attention to Facebook and your emails for more information on that. So with that, a couple of people that I want to introduce. I want to start with Zach. Zach is our cask and cork distributor, and it's because of him that we're able to have Jean with us tonight. Zach is a great friend to our store. He works really hard with us to help bring great wines to all of you. He carries a lot of wines that are more smaller boutique, really amazing values for the price. So we're thankful to you, Zach. Thank you.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And then Jean, our guest of honor. I had the privilege of meeting Jean maybe about a year or so ago. Time all runs together, so something like that. But I love Jean's story, which he'll tell you, but great family winery. His teenage daughter, they get involved, which, as those of you that know us, we've got 2 teenage girls, which we love to get involved. A story of the family connection and working together and building something that they're all passionate about and proud of.
So the first question before I jump into the tasting, does anyone think I look like Bill Gates? I get it all the time. I literally am stopped in airports. I'm like, no, I'm not Bill Gates, but wish I was. I would be producing a lot more wine. So, kind of to Mindy's point, I'm very relaxed about wine tasting and wine presentations. Been in the industry for almost 30 years, and I think for tonight, it would really warm my heart if I was interrupted quite a bit and you all had questions, because I think this forum, and I've done a lot of virtual tastings over the course of the last several weeks, and this forum I think really promotes questions, and would love to answer any questions that you have. So let me give you a little bit of background. So the wines that you're tasting tonight are called Kate Arnold wines. Well, Katie, as I call her, is my wife. And then Mindy had mentioned our daughter, Leela, is also involved in not only just the everyday business, but believe it or not, she helps me a little bit with the winemaking, which I'll talk to you about here in just a minute. So, my background is really more of the corporate wine world. And several years back, after working for a large winery based in Sonoma and having a house in Sonoma, I would go to the office 7 o'clock in the morning, and I sit in a boardroom till 7 o'clock in the evening. And I talked about selling wine, I talked about making wine, and I talked about marketing wine. And frankly, I did none of those. I just spoke about it in a boardroom. And so I really wanted to get back to the roots of the reason and the ultimate reason that I'm in this industry, and that is for the wine in and of itself. And I think the other reason that I'm ultimately in the industry, and I think you all would agree with this, it's really about the people. The great thing about the wine industry is it brings in people from all walks of life. And for me, that's extraordinarily important. And I think that diversity in people is also something that you can experience with the wine, that wine can be as diverse as you want to make it. So I constantly challenge people to continue to try different wines, different varietals, wines from different countries. And I would continue to challenge you all to do that after you participate in tonight's tasting. So Kate Arnold wines. As I was just mentioning to Mindy, as of the latter part of this August, we will have been shipping wines for 3 years. And tonight we have 4 wines that we will taste. Some of you may taste some of them, some of you may taste all of them. And these wines are from California, Oregon, and Washington. So the first question people ask is, why would Jean Arnold and Kate Arnold want to produce wines from 3 different states? And for me, it's a pretty simple philosophy, as I don't let state lines get in the way. What's most important, and one of the common themes that I think that you will see through tasting the wines tonight, it's all about the fruit. So historically, winemaking was all about vineyard sourcing. If you look, for example, at Burgundy or Bordeaux, it's more about the vineyard, in my assessment, than it is the winemaking. Because if you start with good quality materials, ultimately, you're going to be able to make good quality wine. So just briefly about the 3 states. So our Sauvignon Blanc predominantly comes from Lake County. Lake County is just north of Napa. And I'll step back a second. This is very, very simply stated, but there's something called growing degree days in grape growing. So climate 1 is the coldest climate you can have, and climate 5 would be the warmest climate. So for example, I'm sure some of you have consumed wines from Lodi. That climate can be as warm as a climate 4 or climate 5. Whereas a Sonoma County, more specifically like a Russian River Valley, could be a climate 1 or a subclimate 1 where you get really cold fruit. Therefore, it's great for Chardonnay, it's great for Pinot Noir. Well, Lake County specifically is in that 2 to 3 range. So it's great for Sauvignon Blanc. And for me, Lake County on a day-to-day basis is by far the best place to grow Sauvignon Blanc grapes. I think price-quality relationship, it's the best place that you can grow Sauvignon Blanc. And one of the common themes that I'll say tonight, I'm a blue-collar wine guy. I was just joking before I was married, I consumed all my wine out of a water glass. The problem with that is you don't swirl and you drink far too much. So I've at least gone to a stem glass at this point. And why Oregon? Well, for me, Oregon is by far the premier place in the United States to grow Pinot Noir. And if I had to name my favorite varietal, it would be Pinot Noir. And so that's why we're producing Pinot Noir out of Oregon. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we actually consume the wines. And then moving north to Washington State, that's where I like hardier reds. So Cabernet, and Kate and I produce a Cabernet Franc. Unfortunately, Cabernet Franc is very hard to source, and we only made a little less than 200 cases of that particular wine. So the way blue-collar people make wine, for example, Gene Arnold and Kate Arnold, is we are what we call fruit contract based. It's a popular misconception that most people own all their vineyards. It's quite the opposite. The majority of wine consumed, if you were to purchase it at a grocery store, a lot of that is what we refer to bulk wine, meaning that I would call one of you and I'd say, hey, I need 10,000 gallons of Chardonnay. I need it at this sweetness level, this taste profile. I would buy all that juice and then I would put it in my own bottle and put the name Kate Arnold on it. Whereas what Katie and I are very aggressively and constantly pursuing is the best fruit contracts. So we work with small growers. And the reason that we work with small growers is growers are typically really squeezed, if you will, by large wineries. And it's hard in agriculture to make any money. So by us extending grape contracts and fruit contracts to these grape growers, we create relationships on a year in and year out basis that we can not only maintain quality in terms of the fruit and the wine, but we can retain a consistent price point. And I think that's very important for us. So the common theme, again, is really about the fruit. The winemaking takes a back seat. The other thing that's interesting, and I do like to talk about the economics of the business, and feel free to jump in if you have questions, but California, as most of you know, is extraordinarily expensive, right? Just in terms of owning a business, in terms of taxes. So what happens in winemaking, it is a business. You know, we always joke the quickest way to make $1 million in the wine business is start off a billionaire. So it really is more of a passion project. Well, Oregon and Washington, it's a little less expensive to grow. And so we, as wine producers, we aren't tempted to use what I call adjunct materials. So let me talk about that before I jump into actually physically tasting the wines. We don't use any concentrates, so we add no sugar to our wine. I don't use oak products like oak liquid, for example. I don't use oak powder. So we use real oak. And for me, that makes a difference not only in the taste profile, it makes a difference in the quality of the wine. In my assessment, it also makes a difference in how you feel the next morning as well. So these are things that we're afforded the opportunity to use those quality materials because we source out of Oregon and Washington as well. So anyway, so I think you guys get the idea. 2.5 pounds of grapes, right? If it's $7 a pound, so you're looking at $14, $15, right? Before there's fermentation, before there's any oak aging, any aging in the bottle, the glass. So that's why wine costs what it does, right? So let's kind of get to the most important part of the night, and let's. I apologize, I only have Burgundy glasses in my office, so I'm going to be drinking a Bordeaux varietal out of a Burgundy glass. But let's get to the Sauvignon Blanc. So this is the 2018 vintage. So interestingly enough, I'll talk a little bit about the environment. As I've just mentioned, Katie and I have been making wines for soon to be 3 years in terms of selling the wine. 18 was a really tough vintage because if you all remember, 17 was the Napa Valley fires, 18 was the Lake County fires. So we had 2 vineyard contracts in Lake County for our Sauvignon Blanc. And unfortunately, one of the growers that we were using in what's referred to as Upper Lake County actually lost his fruit because his vineyard burned. So what we had to do with our other fruit, which was kind of in the middle of Lake County, an area called Kelseyville, is we had to use what's called free run juice. So free run juice is when you bring in that fruit, just the weight in the bin of the grapes on top of one another will break the skin. And that initial juice is called free run juice. And the reason that we had to do that is because we didn't want any smoke taint in our wine. So to kind of give you a little story on one of our vineyards, we were worried about smoke taint. And so we had to go in pre-fermentation and actually put, and I'm a redneck originally from Alabama, so you may get this. We had to put our fruit in a 5-gallon white bucket and ferment it, even though it wasn't ready to be fermented, to see if any smoke taint would pop up. So smoke taint is something ultimately long-term, unfortunately, in the wine business, specifically in California, Oregon, and Washington, that we're going to have to be cognizant of. So this fruit is free run juice. It all comes from that Kelseyville area in Lake County. And here's what's kind of cool about this is we only, this particular grower, he only grows about and gets about 4 tons of fruit per acre. So when I talk about fruit per acre, the lower the yield per acre, often the higher quality of the fruit, right? Because the more fruit you're vying for the same nutrient sources, and it can dilute the overall taste profile of the wine. And so Sauvignon Blanc from Lake County, as I already mentioned, I think it's you know, great bang for the buck, if you will. This is 100% Sauvignon Blanc. Fermentation is pretty simple. We use a clone that's been around since the last part of the 19th century called the Wente clone, very common. And we use actually a champagne yeast versus a table wine yeast. And the reason that we do that, one of the reasons is we don't like a lot of vegetal quality in our Sauvignon Blanc, nor do we want the same type of acidity or almost that cat pee, if you will, in New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So it's demonstrably different than New Zealand. The other trick to making this wine is Sauvignon Blanc can be very acidic. And so, you know, pH is what measures the acid base in wine. And so the pH on this would be about 3.1, 3.2. So it has a pretty strong acid structure to kind of round out the mouthfeel, because we don't add sugar to our wines. What I do is I take about 30% fruit from Lodi, which is, I just mentioned, is a warmer climate. And by blending that in with this wine, it kind of softens the acid, gives it a little bit of mouthfeel, and makes it a little bit more approachable. So as you can see, there's definitely a citrus component to it, but again, it's not over grapefruit. Slight vegetal qualities, nice acid structure, finishes clean. Acid is typically what allows you to feel like a clean finish. The other thing, how many of you are curious about why we would use screw cap versus cork? Do you guys ever ponder that question? Well, a lot of people think ultimately that a screw cap, that it's about saving money. And it really is a penny's business. I mean, in the wine industry, you don't make a lot of money. You just have a great quality of life. And it's something that you're ultimately very passionate about. So this is actually produced by a company called Stelvin. So because I buy in quantity, I can get this at 12 cents a unit, right? So that would be $1.44 a case. Whereas a real cork could be, oh goodness gracious, I mean, as high as $1 a bottle if you really want a good cork. But the reason that you would use that Stelvin closure is because it's guaranteed that there's not going to be failure. Whereas 10% of all real cork fails. And there's something called TCA, or cork taint, which would kind of smell like, when you open up the bottle of wine, smell like wet socks, if you will, that have been laid out for a couple of days in your garage. Not really the best smell. And so with certain wines, like a Blanc, it really doesn't need what we refer to as oxygen exposure. And so a screw cap is a perfect way to ultimately finish off the wine. So it's not necessarily a cost-cutting measure, because I could buy aggregate cork that would be roughly about the same price. So it's really more about the preservation and the quality of the wine than it is cost savings.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Jean, because that's something in the store that we hear a lot of times, that misconception that when we'll show someone a really nice bottle of wine and I'll have a screw cap and say, oh, I don't want that. That can't be a good wine, because there's that perception that it's a cheaper wine. So I'm glad that you discussed that.
Yeah, I mean, Mindy, I'll tell you, it's actually quite the contrary. So the technical term is called oxygen transfer ratio, right? So with a red wine, for an example, you have a tannin structure and you have oak, and you want those to integrate. So one of the things by using a cork, and believe it or not, screw cap can do this as well, depending on what type of screw cap that you purchase, you can allow for oxygen to get into that bottle, and that'll help soften the wine. So even red wine, let's say Cabernet, for example, that would be $20 retail, some of those screw caps will actually allow oxygen to ultimately permeate into the wine, which will ultimately soften the wine. So it really depends on what the winemaker is trying to achieve. But, regardless of that, at the end of the day, if I knew that 10% of my wine was automatically going to be bad to you, the buyer and or the consumer, why would I want to do that? And so for wines like what Kate and I make, I mean, we do make a couple of what we would refer to as expensive wines that retail right around $40. But most of our wines are under $25. So they're readily accessible from a price point perspective. And therefore, we think that screw cap is much better. Look, I'm 52 years old. I come from the Boone's Farm generation. I know what a screw cap is. But I will tell you that, Australia really started the trend. And I think, long story short, we need to put down any reservation that we have about screw cap and just embrace it and realize that it's ultimately for the preservation, the quality of the wine. This is stainless steel, right? So we don't use any oak. And I will tell you, you'll kind of see this as a theme throughout all the wines, is we use oak in our reds, but I really am all about the aromatics of the wine. And one of the challenges when you use oak is that it can ultimately create more oak aromatic, whereas I want more fruit aromatic because we are so focused in on fruit quality. And before you guys jump into questions on the Sauvignon Blanc, I always like to be very transparent in the cost and how we actually calculate the cost of wine. Mindy, what would you sell this wine for, may I ask?
This one, I believe, $14.99.
So perfect. Price point is perfect. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of winemaking secrets that big companies would never tell you. Most small companies wouldn't want to tell you, but I love kind of breaking down the barriers of knowledge. So this fruit costs us $1,200 a ton, right? Well, in a ton of fruit, you get, if it's white wine, about 60 cases of wine. And I'm sure you guys know there's 12 750 bottles, right? In a case of wine, which equals 9 liters. Well, rough rule of thumb is if your fruit costs $1,200 a ton, then add a couple of dollars, and that is what your retail should be. So you can figure out what my fruit prices are just based off of Mindy's retails.
So I have a question. How
Yes,
many
ma'am.
bricks are the grapes at when you pick them?
When you harvest?
Mm-hmm.
So with Sauvignon Blanc, good question. So Sauvignon Blanc is roughly right around 21 bricks, right? It means 21% of that grape is pure sugar. And remember how I told you, Molly, how we don't add sugar to our wine? So there's kind of 2 ways to add sugar. So there's the French way, which is called chaptalization. And let's take Burgundy or Bordeaux for that matter. Because that climate's a little colder than what we have here in North America, sometimes you would add sugar in order to get the fermentation up and to get the alcohol content up, right? So that's been done for a long time. But the way a lot of sugar is added now is if Kate and I wanted to, and all the taste profiles ultimately are more of Kate's decision, and where I told you how I was going to tell you how our daughter gets involved. Well, I'm a 52-year-old man that continues as I get older to have sinus issues. So my ability to smell is getting less and less. Well, our daughter's 14 and her sniffer is absolutely phenomenal. So that's where she helps us with the blend. But in terms of going back to sugar, Molly, what happens is after I would ferment this wine, right before I would bottle it, if I wanted to sweeten this wine, I would add in a dollop of something called Vino Blanc. And the reason that I bring that to your attention is you asked about Brix level. Well, when you harvest Sauvignon Blanc, it's right around that 21 Brix, right? So the lower sugar, the higher acid structure, the reason it's like at that 3.1, 3.2 pH. But if I added this Vino Blanc concentrate, the Brix level is like 60 to 70 Brix. So it's literally raisinated fruit with a high sugar level. And I don't want to do that, one, from a caloric perspective, right? Because there's no truth in labeling. And, you know, while Kate and I haven't got to it, at some point we're going to put on the back of the bottle that we don't add sugar, because I think the consumer inevitably would want to know that. Long story short, good question. On the Brix 21, Pinot Noirs typically right around, depends, 24, 25.
We have somebody who didn't want to unmute themselves because I think they have a lot of background noise where they're at, but they commented that they thought they got some fig from this, which they typically wouldn't get from a California Sauvignon Blanc. So just an interesting thing that they got on the nose and wanted to point out.
So with our sourcing in Lake County, fig seems to be more predominant as compared to a lot of other Sauvignon Blanc appellations. Specifically, if you look at like Sonoma County, there's more pyrazine quality, which is vegetal quality, comes from the skin of the grape. And there's also much more of a vegetal quality. And as I like to joke, I like to eat my vegetables. I don't necessarily like to drink them, right? And so that's just my particular, but what I will tell you is inherently Sauvignon Blanc is a grape, should have vegetal quality. And since we're going to taste Cabernet tonight, Cabernet, if you think about it, Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc are the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon. So historically, Cabernet Sauvignon in California, people try and mitigate and get rid of that little, some of that vegetal quality. With Washington State, we actually like to keep a little bit of the vegetal quality there because it's true to the, if you will, the typicity of the fruit in the appellation.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah. What other questions on the Sauvignon Blanc? Can you guys feel the acid structure, but feel that it finishes?
How do you achieve the weight of the wine? I've always thought this Sauvignon Blanc to have a really nice texture to it.
Yeah, dude, good question. That's that Lodi. So when you have a warmer fruit, right? So if you look at grape growing is simple in the sense that, and again, sometimes, you know, there's a lot of people in the wine business that have a little bit of knowledge and they try and make it too difficult. Like I told you, I'm kind of the blue collar wine guy. So growing a grape is all about sugar production, right? To Molly's point, that Brix level, and then acid production. And if you look at a good grape growing region, what is the one thing that they all have in common? It's what's referred to as the diurnal swing. Like, for example, in Paso, which I'm sure you guys have probably had some cabs from Paso, man, it can get down to like 35 degrees at night. It can get up to 110 during the day. And so when that weather is really warm, guess what's happening? It's sugar production. And when it's cold, it keeps that acid in balance. Well, by blending in that Lodi, Zach, because it's a warmer climate, that's where you get that mouthfeel, because it creates a level of viscosity to complement the acid structure from Lake County. But if I did 100% Lodi Sauvignon Blanc, just in my assessment, Zach, it would be almost too viscous. It wouldn't be as viscous as milk, but it would be a little flabby, if you will, from a profile perspective. I would tell you that, you know, food and wine pairing is all about fats and acids, right? So you can do either comparison or contrast. And here's the thing I tell everybody. Everybody asks me this all the time: what's your favorite wine? And someone taught me this a long time ago, and I think it's a great statement. It's like, hopefully I've never found it, right? Meaning that I'm going to continue to pursue. And what they're often doing is asking me, like, what grape or what wine they should drink. And if you all think it's a good wine, then it's a good wine, right? Because the way we perceive things are completely different. But in terms of food and wine pairing, fats and acids, right? So let's take salmon as an example I always use, right? Because I lived in Sweden for a couple of years and I've had enough salmon to last me a lifetime. It's a fatty fish, right? Well, if you had a Chardonnay that went through malolactic fermentation, which I could explain if you want, but it can kind of have a fatty component too. So that's kind of a fat and a fat. Whereas to your point, you were talking about the Sauvignon Blanc with some spicy food, like Indian food that has a sauce to it. The Sauvignon Blanc, that acid will cut right through that sauce, and that sauce is going to be fat-based, right? So it's a pretty simple thought process, and there's rules of thumb, but at the end of the day, if you like it, that's what's most important. Shall we move on to Oregon?
We shall.
Let's do.
Cool. So we have 2 wines from Oregon tonight. And if you guys have the glassware, is to kind of do a comparison and contrast, right? So both are obviously from Oregon. One is from even though the one with the burgundy cap is just labeled Oregon, more specifically, it comes from the Rogue Valley. Well, just to kind of give you an idea, to drive where this fruit is grown to the Willamette Valley, where the fruit is grown for our Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, is about a 5-hour drive. So I'm closer where the Oregon wine is made. I'm 10 minutes from the California line. Whereas Willamette Valley, for those of you that have been there, it is just, depending on traffic, 45 minutes at most to an hour south of Portland. So the climate is demonstrably different. And they're 2 unique taste profiles. So you probably should have both 17 vintages would be my guess. And 17 was, it was a little colder, and that's what I like about Oregon. It's typically a colder climate for Pinot Noir as compared to California. So, Molly had asked the question from a bricks level. I'm going to get roughly, if I let the fruit hang out, it's going to be somewhere right around 25 bricks, which will give me sugar and a little bit higher alcohol content, but it's still going to be much higher in acid structure than most Pinot Noirs from California. So one of the things I talked about in winemaking, whether it's the Oregon Pinot Noir, the Willamette, our Cabernet, our Sauvignon Blanc, because I don't like to be heavy-handed in winemaking and I don't like to manipulate. So a lot of people ask me, are my wines that Katie and I produce, are they vegan? And yes, they are. So what does that mean? And it's a good introduction to the Oregon Pinot Noir. So when you make wine, there's sediment in wine, right? So there's several ways that you can kind of mitigate that sediment. You can move the wine from barrel to barrel, and then that sediment resides in the empty barrel. And by the process of doing that, you ultimately clarify the wine. Well, then there's filtration, which we all understand that's a mechanical process, right? Where you put wine through a filter. Well, the more you filter that wine, the more fruit that comes out of that wine, the more taste profile that comes out of that wine. So I don't like to do a lot of that either. So none of the wines are fine. And fining is a coagulant process. It's where proteins bind, not to get too technical, but in order to fine a wine, you have to add like an animal protein. So egg whites are used, fish guts, something called isinglass is used. And so that's where wine becomes non-vegan, if you will. So we don't do any of that. So the Oregon Pinot Noir is unfined, it's unfiltered, nor is it cold stabilized. So there's tartrates in wine. Think of cream of tartar. But if you can see my cap, you see that? So that is sediment and tartrate of the wine, right? So there's nothing wrong with it. That's intentional. And because the fruit from Southern Oregon can be really delicate and a little thinner in quality, I don't like to fine it. I don't like to filter it, nor do I like to cold stabilize it. So this wine, before I drink it, actually has 10% of the Willamette Valley in it. So I took via truck and actually trucked some Willamette Valley Pinot Noir juice down to the Southern Oregon facility to blend. So this is brighter in color. It's going to be more angular. What do I mean by angular? Not a fancy tasting term, but the acid is going to be more pronounced, and the fruit is going to be a little thinner. And I don't mean that in the negative or the pejorative. This is actually, in my mind, going to be more Burgundy-like, more French in style. Definitely a cranberry note for those of you that have good sniffers. Mindy, did you, I know we talked about like the temperature of wine. I don't know if you, did you send anything out to the everybody that's on the call to talk about the temperature? Do you want me to touch base on that?
Yeah, I did. I gave them the instructions that you had. So maybe you can touch base on kind of the whys of that.
Yeah, so long story short, in the United States, we drink our whites too cold and our reds too warm. So really a red wine should be somewhere right around that 55 degrees. Historically, that was known as room temperature. I would humbly suggest, whether the winter or the summer, most of you guys and gals aren't keeping your homes at 55 degrees. So we think of room temperature different. Well, you want, like when you buy a bottle, specifically from Oregon, when you buy a bottle of Pinot Noir from Oregon, because of the acid structure is going to be, there's going to be a stronger acid base than most Pinot Noirs out of California. By throwing it in the fridge, like if I went to the, and bought a bottle from Mindy, I'd go home, I'd throw it in the fridge for about 30 minutes just to kind of knock the heat off of it. And that'll soften and negate a little bit of the acid. And it'll make for a better marriage between the fruit and the acid. And so that's why we throw it in the fridge for about 30 minutes. There's nothing worse than a warm Pinot Noir. So while you're kind of tasting the Oregon Pinot Noir, the oak regimen here is a little different than the Willamette Valley. So if I use completely new oak on this, the new oak would kill the fruit aromatics and it would be too much for the overall fabric of the wine. So the overall kind of default position is there's some 2-year oak in this if my memory serves, but most of the oak is older. So what that oak does, remember how we were talking about screw caps and corks, is when I'm putting this oak in a barrel, it just provides a great opportunity for that oak to become oxygenated, which allows that wine to soften and age, right? And because we're not manipulating, this wine still has a lot of aging potential, even as a 17 vintage. So there's a process that I'll tell you about, and it happens a lot in Cabernet, and it happens more so in California than anywhere, and it's called micro-ox, where, you know, it is a business. So in order to produce a Cabernet, you have to sit on that wine for a long time. A lot of winemakers will shoot oxygen either into the barrel or into a stainless steel tank to prematurely age the wine. And I don't like to do that because that wine doesn't have near the aging potential if you do it more of a natural way. And so I like kind of the old-fashioned winemaking. I'm a big fan of this Pinot Noir. I mean, every once in a while, like I said, it'll throw some sediment, but from a price quality perspective, it's phenomenal. So Mindy, what would you sell this wine for?
This one is, I don't know, $20.99, give or take.
And then what's the Willamette, Miss Mindy?
That I believe is $21.99. I don't have my sheet in front of me, so you're testing me right now. But
no, it's fair, and those prices don't surprise me at all. I guess here's my point. Even though Oregon appellation is a broader appellation, the fruit for Southern Oregon is almost as expensive as Willamette Valley. So that's why the prices are kind of close to one another. And just two ultimately different taste profiles. So let's kind of move on. Again, if you have the glassware, let's move on to the Willamette Valley and do a comparison and contrast. So remember I talked about fining, filtration, and cold stabilization. Again, winemaking terms, you know, you don't really need to remember, but this wine is vegan too, so I don't use any protein add to it. It is what's called roughly filtered, right? So there's still live organisms in here that you have to be careful with. So we do some lab analyses to make sure the wine is going to be shelf stable. And then we do cold stabilize this, meaning that if it can get down to like 30 degrees without tar traits. But this wine, in my assessment, is darker in color than the Oregon Pinot Noir. And the way I keep most fruit in the Willamette Valley is typically somewhere right around $2,600 a ton, which effectively would mean that this wine should cost about $30 a bottle. Well, Katie and I lean, number one, and we want to make sure that we have good price quality relationship. Excuse me, but within the Willamette Valley, there's a little town called Monmouth. And north of Monmouth is called the Northern Willamette area, and south of Monmouth is called the Southern Willamette Valley area. And Southern Willamette Valley is a little less expensive fruit, but the quality, in my assessment, can be just as good, if not better. And so we highly lean on Southern Willamette Valley fruit to keep the cost down. And there's two things that we use. One's called Elkhorn Ridge, and it always gives, God, I just absolutely love it. It always gives like a spice rack. You know, some people say cinnamon, some people say sandalwood, but there's always a baking spice component to it. And the oak regimen on this, it's all older oak. So, I mean, these oak barrels are anywhere from 3 years. I think we get rid of them, it's 7 years. And so all it's doing is just providing a place for that fruit to, or that wine to oxygenate and to soften. I absolutely love Oregon Pinot Noirs. Love this one.
Gene, you had mentioned that the fruit or the skin on the Oregon appellation wine was a thinner skin.
Yeah, it can be a thinner skin. Also, it's not as robust because depending on where you are in Oregon, where you're sourcing from, you know, whether it's Applegate, Rogue, where have you, you know, there's certain vineyards you can get as little as 7 inches of rainfall, Zach, on an annual basis. There's some vineyards you can get as much as 40. Whereas the Willamette, you know, is much closer towards the 40 inches a year. And so it's a warmer climate, a little thinner skinned, and, you know, thinner skin, you're going to get, you know, often a lighter color wine, right? It also depends on how you press the fruit too, but we don't do really harsh presses, meaning we don't try and squeeze everything out of the grape that we possibly can, Zach, because the more you do that, the more you can get a negative taste component and qualities. But I mean, this is pretty simply made. I mean, this fruit comes in and we destem it, right? So we literally take the stem away from the fruit. We put it in an open fermentation bin. It may cold soak for a day or two, which helps with like fruit extraction and flavor extraction. And then we ferment it for about 9 days, and it goes, try and get the temperatures up to like 90 degrees. Ultimately goes into the press, then it goes to barrel, and then something called malolactic fermentation, which fancy term. How many of you all, just raise a hands, have had a Granny Smith apple before? Yeah. Well, when you bite into a Granny Smith apple, that tart taste, that's malic acid. Well, malic acid is in wine grapes too. So in order to soften it, you go through a secondary fermentation. The reason it's called malolactic, it goes from malic acid to lactic acid. So lactic, think of milk. So it softens it and creates a little bit of a mouthfeel. And that's what, Zach, remember how you asked me about mouthfeel? That'll soften up a wine and change the mouthfeel too. Mm-hmm.
It is surprising how different they are, you know, from the same state. But as you mentioned, you know, different regions with different amounts of rainfall and probably sunlight and everything. But it's interesting. I'd be interested to hear from the people, which one, what do you kind of like? Do you go to the more Burgundian, the Oregon, or the second one, the Willamette Valley? Brian, I know you have a preference. Come on, unmute yourself.
Bring it.
Oh, we can't hear anybody.
Yeah, there he is.
Yeah, so Chris and I both like the Willamette. I guess so it seems like it's a little bit smoother, and like you can definitely tell the difference in the color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one I found it to be very spicy. It had a really nice spicy character to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of baking spice to it, so it was nice.
Yeah, and that's literally comes from that Elkhorn Ridge vineyard. I mean, that's the thing, like the way we make wine, it's all about the fruit sourcing. And I mean, you can be in a vineyard going down one row, let's say it's south facing or vineyard, one row. And if there's an elevation, a higher elevation at the top of the row versus the end of the row is a lower elevation, and there's going to be a different sun impact, that fruit's going to taste completely different. And that is absolutely what's awesome if you don't manipulate the wine with some of the modern winemaking practices. Because, you know, when I was talking about wine product, like, you know, trying to make wine taste the same every time, I'm not saying that's bad, but that's more manufacturing. That's where the chemistry set comes in. Whereas this is more about the fruit, trying to keep the winemaking congruent with the actual fruit that you get from Mother Nature.
And Dee, are you going to tell us which one you like best?
Yeah, I concur. The Willamette Valley for sure is very, very good. They're both good, but that's my favorite for sure.
And I see Andrew and Joy and their group said they like the Willamette Valley as well.
I was just going to say, the other thing that's important about Oregon Pinot Noir, Oregon, it doesn't matter who's producing wine from Oregon. Oregon is much more zealous, if you will, about the quality of the fruit, the way it's made. And, you know, just to call a wine Oregon Pinot Noir by law, state laws differ, right? So 90% of this wine by law has to be Pinot Noir. Where if it's a California Pinot Noir, only 75% has to be Pinot Noir. And I'm not trying to diminish or demean California. They're just two different things, right? But I think for Pinot Noir, I'm just such a fan of Oregon.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I will fess up. I actually, my taste profile, I love the Willamette. It's our best-selling wine. I'm just partial to the Oregon.
Well, now you make me look like I'm trying to kiss up, because before you said that, I was going to say I actually like the Oregon, I think, a little bit better. I like a little more of that angular Burgundy.
Well, I mean, I think in wine tasting, here's the thing, right? There's the first assessment is the objective. Is it made with quality fruit, you know, no adjuncts, no liquid oak, things of that nature. And like all these vineyards are dry farms, which big fan of. The vineyard practices are very solid. And then it really just comes down to the subjective, is like, which one do you like better? So none of it hurts my feelings, I can tell you that. Being in the wine business for a long time, you have to understand that not everyone's going to love your wines. I think just my opinion, right? And so let's just keep it at that. But I do think that Pinot Noir as a varietal, as compared to Cabernet, Pinot Noir is much more multifaceted. I think Cabernet is more directional, if you will. And don't get me wrong, you can make it in different ways, but I think the taste components are more one-dimensional. But like I said, that's my opinion. The reality is it doesn't matter what my opinion is terms of varietal. It's like whatever you like and what your taste profile likes is what's most important. Doesn't matter what tasting you ever attend. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. I mean, inevitably it's up to what you want. My only suggestion is when you taste wines, it's the objective part is how is the wine made? How is the fruit sourced? How is it grown? And then it comes down to the subjective.
So with the Oregon, you showed the cap, and it had some, I guess I'll say some of this at the top, but the Willamette does not.
Yes, sir.
And can you explain the reason for that again, please?
Yeah. No worries. So first of all, the reason it's in the cap is when you bottle red wine, it goes through something called bottle shock, right? Sometimes that red wine will never taste the same again, believe it or not. But so there's two ways to age wine. Typically, I like to bottle age all red wines 90 days before I would ship to, Zach, who's our local distributor in Iowa. And the other method is, and we kind of jokingly say this, excuse me, it's truck aging. Meaning, as soon as that thing is bottled and we know it's not going through any type of secondary fermentation and it's stable, we put it on the truck and it's gone. And the reason a lot of companies do that, it's cash flow, right? Because I do talk about the business aspect of it. But the reason it's on the cap is because we store the bottles, this is called the point down, right? Because typically it's the bore of the bottle right, is where a lot of the sediment is going to gather. Without getting into too much detail, the reason it was stored upside down is because I was storing it and I'm trying to make sure cash flow is good. I didn't label it. And it's easier when it's stored upside down
Sure.
to move it back to the bottling line to label it. So why it's actually present in the Oregon versus the Willamette, well, the Willamette's actually filtered. So that sediment goes away. Now, there's different levels of filtration. So it's measured in microns, right? And it's basically a pad you put into the filtration machine. And it's diatomaceous, or a fancy word for basically chalk, right? But we get the bugs out, as we say. But if I really, there's a little Brettanomyces in this wine. Brettanomyces you filter out. So we filter at 5 microns. In order to get Brettanomyces out, it would be 0.65. To make it completely sterile would be 0.45. And we don't like to do that because we think that, again, that fruit component comes out. But the Oregon Pinot Noir is not cold stabilized, nor is there any filtration. So that sediment is still present. So what you're getting is a combination of sediment and tartrates, because somewhere along the line, this wine would have gotten cold enough, whether it's in Zach's warehouse or the warehouse that we utilize out west, and some of those tartrates would have formed.
Okay, thank you.
So just to kind of clarify a point that some of our guests actually have, when there's sediment in the bottom of the bottle, that's a natural occurring part of winemaking. So sediment is actually not considered a wine flaw. And tartaric acid, which are these actually, you shouldn't call this a flaw. This is actually wine diamonds is what they're called. It's actually a normally occurring phenomenon with the chemical structure in the wine. And so, the way the bottle is built is meant to try to trap some of the sediments so they don't go into the glass. But we all have to realize that with this natural product, there's going to be sediments in the wine from the proteins, as well as the tartaric acid crystals. So when you get those, again, it's just part of the kind of the ambiance of having a bottle of wine. You let it settle, let it sit on its bottom so that the solids settle out. And then when you pour very slowly. So the solids, especially in a Cabernet, a shoulder bottle, the shoulder is there, so the solids get trapped in the shoulder before you pour them, and it pours across. So just so you know, the solids in the wine, or the sediments, are actually not impurities. They don't actually even say anything about quality at all. Most quality wines are going to have these, especially after time.
That's right, because if you filter all the way down to where it's a sterile filtration, often prior to that filtration, you're going to add components in the wine that would offset the flavor loss through the filtration. You don't necessarily want to do that. There's some new filtration methods that have been like something called crossflow that's pretty soft on the wine, but all of this is part of the winemaking process. If you look at most wineries, if you actually ever have the chance to visit wineries, a lot of wineries, they will never have a 90-degree angle in any of their piping, because that harsh angle can bruise the wine, and it's not something that ultimately they want. So that's just a little tidbit. So, but to your point, Paul, that's exactly right. I don't find I like the wine that it's not even touched. And for me as a winemaker, I think it just really, it's at its purest form, if you will.
Right, absolutely.
Any questions on the Pinot Noirs, Oregon, wine business in general before we move to the Cabernet?
How come the Oregon Pinot Noir is a lighter color, since it comes from a warmer climate and it's also been filtered? Or has not been filtered?
Well, again, it goes back to the grape. It goes back to the skin. It also depends on clonal selection. So, for example, Zach, there's one vineyard that we use for the Willamette Valley. It's in the Willamette Hills, and it's a vineyard called Cubanissimo. It's actually owned by a gentleman who's a brain surgeon in Portland, of Cuban descent, if you couldn't figure it out with the name Cubanissimo. And it's the Wadensville clone, as it's called, and it just throws really dark fruit. And I actually use that vineyard specifically for that, to kind of darken the color of the Willamette Valley. From a clonal selection, well, I don't use any Wadensville clone in the Oregon.
Jean, we have a great question from, I think, Wendy. What temp should we store the Pinot Noir at if we don't finish the bottle? Room temperature and then chill before serving, or should we put it back in the refrigerator and keep it chilled and then bring it out half hour or so before we're drinking it?
Man, that is a phenomenal question. I would tell you this, I would put it in the fridge. Now, granted, when you take it out, because it's been in the fridge, let's say overnight, you're gonna have to let it warm up a little bit, right? Because being in the fridge overnight or for whatever, 12, 20 hours is much longer than throwing something in the fridge for 30 minutes prior to consuming it. What I would tell you is that, again, it depends on the wine, but as I just mentioned, the wines that Kate and I produce, because we're not going to that high level of filtration, just that, let's say, room temperature of 70 degrees left out, perhaps it's left out by the kitchen sink and there's a window there, if you will, and it can warm up even more. I would definitely put it in the fridge.
Gina, I have a question.
Yes.
So you grow grapes and bottle wine in 3 different states. How do you ensure quality control and your spin on the wine when it's happening in 3 different places?
Yeah, well, it's a phenomenal question, and it to answer in the most succinct way, I would say it's extraordinarily difficult. What I would tell you is this: from a harvest perspective, Sauvignon Blanc comes in first, right? Number one, if you remember Molly's question, that's at 21 bricks, and so I'm always trying to be there for harvest because that's important to me. Whereas you're going to look at a late October, mid-October on the Oregon Pinot Noir, and late October, sometimes November on the Cabernet in Washington State. Now, look, it's Mother Nature, and year after year, things happen. And sometimes one of the things about producing wine is it's kind of like textbook, right? There's textbook and then there's real world. Well, textbook, it's always a perfect world. Well, there is no such thing in winemaking. So for me, what we do is we don't own our own winery, but what I do is I find small family wineries that have extra tank space, and I'll come in and buy the barrels. I will pay them a fee perhaps to use their manpower, and it helps them because, and again, this is the financial side of the business from a production perspective. If their tanks aren't full and their space is not utilized, their cost to produce is quite expensive. So the quality control piece from a harvest perspective isn't hard because you're working with each individual grower. That grower, if they're a good grower, which I would humbly suggest that Katie and I have been fortunate to only work with good growers, is they're going to send you lab reports on a daily basis to tell you where that fruit is, what the chemistry of that fruit is, most specifically where the bricks level are. And so you're always involved in that decision. It's the grower's responsibility to actually ship the grapes to the winery. And with it, when you have a contract, you work out all those minute details. Now, this past year, I will tell you, my individual harvest times didn't work out as planned. And one of the things that Kate and I've had a little bit of problems with, and not just us, by the way, it's just the wine industry. Remember, I said 17 was Napa Valley fires, 18 was Lake County. Well, 19 this past year, Washington State, we weren't planning on harvesting that fruit until the latter part of October, very late October. Well, long story short, at the end of September, my grower calls me. I'm out traveling, and he's like, Gene, if we don't pick tonight, we're going to lose the fruit. And I said, what's up? He goes, quick storms coming in. It's going to be the coldest cold snap we've ever had on record in late September. And so if that fruit freezes, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but one of the negative components of that would be like this rose smell that is so pungent that you can't make good wine out of it. So it's not a perfect thought process in terms of timing, but more often than not, it works out. And like the Oregon Pinot Noir or the Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, those vineyards are 30 minutes from that winery. And what you have to do is it really comes down to, and this is not the sexy part of the wine business, but it comes down to logistics, because you're thinking tank space, you're thinking what manpower do you have. Where I make the wine in the Willamette in McMinnville, we have volunteer crews that come in and help us with crush, because it's such a labor intensive period, those first like 60 days of the winemaking process. Phenomenal question though. So for those of you that have the Cabernet, did you guys have the cork handy?
Yes.
So this is made out of sugar cane. There's no cork in this whatsoever. As I understand, biodegradable, recyclable, and that's why I like it. You'll notice that I don't put a foil on the bottle. As a parent with a 14-year-old daughter, I concern myself about the environment. As a person in the wine industry trying to always continue to produce better and better quality wine, we have concerns with the environment and some of the continued lack of predictability. And so we like to be as green as possible, and that's why we don't use a foil. And this cork doesn't fail like a regular cork would at 10%. So this would be just a little more expensive than the screw cap that's on either the Sauvignon Blanc or the two Oregon Pinot Noirs. But what I really like about this cork, and you'll notice this Cabernet to be a soft Cabernet. And it's not because, if you all recall, the shortcut is you can micro-ox and inject oxygen in that wine to prematurely age it. Well, this is what I call poor man's micro-ox, meaning you do it in a more natural way. Because this is man-made, this is actually made in North Carolina, it's French technology. But you can track and you know exactly how much oxygen is passing via this cork, man-made cork, I should say, into the wine. And there's different types of man-made cork that you can buy. This is called a Noma cork. So I make a really high-end for us, very small production Pinot Noir. It's $40, comes from a single vineyard in the Willamette Hills, beautiful. And it has a lot of aging potential. And so it allows a graduated amount of oxygen over several years. Whereas with this Cabernet, what I do is I allow a lot of oxygen for like the first year and a half, 2 years, and then it basically tightens and the oxygen is minimized, the oxygen transfer is minimized. The technology behind it, I don't necessarily understand, but the actual stats behind it and the tech behind it is pretty amazing. So one of the things I've talked about tonight as we jump into the cab is I'm a purist, meaning don't like a lot of winemaking manipulation. It's all about the fruit. This is the one wine, the Sauvignon Blanc is 100% Sauvignon Blanc, predominantly from Lake County, if you recall. The Pinot Noir from Oregon is 100% Pinot Noir, even though I blend in some Willamette Valley, but still 100% Pinot Noir. The Willamette Valley is 100% Pinot Noir. This is actually 95% Cabernet and 5% Syrah. So why do I add Syrah? Well, you could do it from an economic perspective. It often could be less expensive than Cabernet. Not necessarily the case here. Cabernet can be angular, and Syrah, and Zach has mentioned this a couple of times, it provides mouthfeel. And I like mouthfeel to wine. I want it to be balanced between the tannin structure, and Syrah can add that mouthfeel. The negative of adding Syrah is Syrah can have, I don't want to say pungent aromatics, but very strong aromatics. Like for those of you that like Syrah, there's like one of the components, aromatic components could be bacon fat. well, I don't want bacon fat on my Cabernet. This particular Syrah didn't have any. Both the Syrah and the Cabernet come from a vineyard within the 47 Hills called McNary. And consistent theme, whether it's the Cab, the Pinots, or the Sauvignon Blanc, there's no vineyard that we use where we crop more than 5 tons per acre, which, again, because you all perhaps have not been introduced to that, you know, in California, in certain appellations, if you wanted to, and some growers do, you'll get up to 12 tons of fruit per acre. So little vegetal quality in this Cabernet, as I mentioned, which again, I think is ultimately part of the typicity, if you will, of Washington State. You know, Horse Heaven Hills is south. Columbia Valley is like me saying the state of Iowa. It's about one of the largest appellations you can discuss. But Horse Heaven Hills is extraordinarily warm, and with that, you get warm fruit. If it gets too warm, you can get too much vegetable piercing quality within the wine. So one of the things that we're going to do moving forward, because we do see the weather trend getting warmer in Horse Heaven, is we're actually going to move a lot of our sourcing about an hour and a half north to an area called the Royal Slope. But if you like a good, round, rich Cabernet, this would be a Cabernet that you would enjoy. Oak aging is about 9 months. And what I do here is, so to buy a brand new oak barrel, I'll talk about that for a second. If I bought a brand new French oak barrel holds about 25 cases of wine. That would be $1,200. So that's a pretty pricey. And you know, over the course of the last 2 years, I bought, and trust me, Katie and I aren't wealthy. If anything, we're the other way, considering we're in the wine business. But you know, we bought 150 barrels, if you will. So to keep this wine affordable, it's a combination of new oak, used oak, and what's called 2-year oak. So a new French oak barrel, like I said, is $1,200. Well, a 2-year-old oak barrel is $100. And so then what we'll do is we'll use, and I'm very open about this, we'll use what's called staves, but it's still real oak. It's basically a barrel cut up, and we'll put a stave in the barrel to freshen up the oak component. Because again, I don't like to use oak liquid, you know, oak powder, things that I believe never integrate within the wine and ultimately aren't good for you.
So Jean, you mentioned that with this wine, you don't harvest more than 5 tons per acre versus sometimes up to 12. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what does that mean from a quality, or maybe the more appropriate, is it from a taste standpoint and a consumer?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, Mindy, like, let's take, so there's an appellation in California. The county's called Yolo County. You all would know it because it's basically Sacramento. And, you know, there's a lot of grape growers in that Clarksburg area. And it's good. And again, I talk about this a lot, but it's a good everyday appellation for wines under, you know, $20. But because California is so, if you will, what's the word I'm looking for? Farm friendly in terms of what it can grow. You can grow, like I said, up to 12 tons of Chardonnay per acre. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the more fruit on that vine, right, the more it's vying for the same nutrients. So ultimately what happens, and there's no one that's really mastered this at this point, otherwise it would have been done, but it just absolutely dilutes the quality of it. So, you know, taste components for Chardonnay, right? Apple would be one. You would barely be able to, it would taste more watery apple than it would apple. So the only way to make that fruit any better is to ultimately manipulate it. And there's certain varietals that are more vigorous than others, right? Like I would never want to get past about 4, like you're pushing it with Pinot Noir at 5 tons, right? It's really better around 4 tons. And the reason I talk about tons and tons per acre is it all matters. Remember how I mentioned, like we make that expensive Pinot Noir that's $40 retail a bottle? That's 2.5 tons of fruit per acre. But I pay $4,000 a ton for that fruit. So that's where you have to work with the growers, because the growers, and I don't blame them, because it's so hard to make a living. Because let me just give you a number, Mindy. So there's 420 million cases of wine in the US, right? That's basically the consumption. A little over 30% of that is import. So I call this Alabama math. You're down to about 280 million cases, right? 280 million cases, 3 producers are like over 200 million of that. So those are the guys and gals that go to the growers and push them on price. And so the grower has to overcrop in order to make any money. That's why growers like small wineries like us, because we're more in it for the quality, and we'll pay, a fair and equitable price. And that's something that with wine product, they don't necessarily care about, production. But one of the things, like when you're buying more expensive wine, if you can ever find out those details, like if you're buying a bottle of $40 bottle of wine retail, then I sure hope that it would be 2.5 tons of fruit or less, because, if that Willamette Valley was at 2.5 tons versus 4 tons, that Willamette Valley fruit would be better. But as you just mentioned, you're only charging $22 a bottle for it versus 40. So there's a balance in the economics, but it's ultimately, long story short, just a dilution of quality.
Thank you.
Comments? I haven't had anyone sick with the wine, so I think that's good.
How does a guy from Alabama end up making wine in Oregon?
Well, so it's a very good question. Thank you. Believe it or not, I probably should have said this. I was born in Davenport, Iowa, 52 years ago. So,
Yay!
yeah, and only lived there for 6 months, but my grandfather grew up in Iowa, was originally from Iowa. My father lived in Iowa for years. Long story short, father starts a company in Alabama. That's kind of how we got there. I went to the University of Alabama and the University of Georgia for graduate school. And so I like to say, when you're University of Alabama and University of Georgia educated, you graduate with a good personality. I started drinking wine in college, and I was a history major, and believe it or not, back then there was a history club, and we did a wine tasting on campus, which God knows you probably couldn't do that nowadays. And I went to work for very large companies, and I understood that these companies, large wine companies, and this one particular wine company had a European program. So I got to live overseas for about 6 years. I lived in Stockholm, Sweden, and I managed all the Nordic markets for a large winery, and I lived in Germany for about 2 years. And just kind of a passion, and probably my entry before the wine business was when I was working on my master's thesis for graduate school. I was in DC, and I know this is going to shock some people, but this was pre-internet. And so I had to go to DC to do my master's research, and there was a bar there / restaurant called the Brickskeller. It closed down about 7 years ago. It opened up in the latter part of the 50s, and it served 1,200 different beers under one roof. And at age 22, that was a lot of fun. And every Monday they would put us through a beer. This is no joke. We absolutely love this. They would put us through a beer class for 10 weeks straight, from 6 to 10 every Monday for 10 weeks. And you can imagine Tuesday morning was always, it was a blur to say the least. And they were very serious about their beer education. And when people would come into this bar / restaurant, they would quiz us on beer, and we had to know our beers. And so that kind of fueled, between the wine interest I had in undergraduate, the beer experience, and then I have 2 older brothers. My brother closest to me in age worked at a French restaurant in Alabama. I know that's hard to believe. And he was always bringing home killer bottles of wine, and that's kind of how it all started. So wine with a personality, how's that? I am really happy, though, to answer any questions. Really appreciate the time on Kate Arnold and Kate Arnold Wines. I mean, for us, Katie and I are very passionate about what we put in the wine and how we make the wine. And we stand behind every bottle in terms of the way it's produced. We have nothing to hide. And so we're very proud of those wines. But I'm also a student of the business, and I like talking about the business side of it. And you often won't get that in wine presentations. So if there's anything that you all have always wanted to ask and have not asked, not that I have the answer, I'm happy to answer any of those questions now as well. I had mentioned earlier that Kate Leland and I produced a Cabernet Franc. And I can't remember the exact case amount. I think it was like 150 cases. Zach got a little bit of it, and only because I love Zach. And we would produce 500 cases of it if we could, but there's not a lot of growers that produce it. And that's because it's not in the business interest of the grower, because it's quite a risk as to whether they can sell that fruit or not. So growing fruit is very volatile. And the reason I think it's volatile is we're really proud that we have a contract in Dundee Hills in Oregon and within the Willamette Valley for Gamay. And it took me literally 2 years to find a Gamay contract to be able to produce Gamay. Mm-hmm. But we like the family story. About 70% of all wine is sold in grocery stores. There's nothing wrong with grocery stores, but it's a different business than what you're trying to accomplish. And I think people are better served going to smaller retailers, because once you create a relationship with the the individual buyer, he or she knows your taste profile, and that's when you really can turn on the world of exploration, I think, with wine. But again, I'm probably a little biased there.
So we have all of these big names that we all love and we all like to see, but in reality, there's so many great family producers and developers like Kate Arnold. And I would challenge you to look at that when you go to buy a wine. And you can find some very expensive wines that on the back it'll say vinted or cellared and bottled. That just means they had a truck drive up and they put it in the bottles and put their label on it. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, where Gene and Kate have a passion and are doing something for the greater good. So cheers to Kate Arnold.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we do feel strongly about it, because, here's the thing. If you look at, that's why I always talk about 2.5 pounds of grapes, Paul, is because if you look at, I guess the word perhaps is scrutiny, but people often now want to know where their food comes from. Right. They want to know, how it's grown, is there pesticide use, things like that. But in terms of wine, I guess it's because it's a finished product. People don't think of it as an agricultural product. And what I'd like to do is just elevate the conversation, not necessarily because it's going to give me a competitive edge, but it's more about the consumer. We are adamant that we are ultimately going to change our labels. And again, it's just a matter of time, right? There's only so much one can do in a day. And like, we put no sugar added. And, we were talking earlier about a brand on, Facebook that talks about, it's all heavily marketed, and, it says that, there's no sugar. Most wine should be, as we talked about, technically fermented dry. That's the idea. That's how you get the alcohol. And so I'd like to see it open up, and the information open, because I think it would just be best for the consumer. And I think you all deserve that. I really do.
Gene, we have another question that was submitted. Can you talk a little bit about if there are some differences that you see between Washington and Oregon in terms of the overall kind of product and what a consumer can expect?
Let's start here. So, for those of you, just kind of a raise of hands. Are you guys kind of starting to drink wine from Oregon, or Oregon Pinot Noir, or Chardonnay, or Pinot Gris? Is that something? Okay. So this is Cheyenne. That was very emphatic. That was awesome. Hey, you too. That was good. That was good. But Oregon is only 1% of the overall wine business in the U.S. Only produces, and it sounds like a lot, but 4 million cases. And I just told you that the wine business is about 420 million cases. Washington State, conversely, is much larger. It's about 8%. And that's because of a big grower there called Chateau Ste. Michelle. So there's a difference right there. Washington State is much larger and has more, like, what I would refer to as branded wines, kind of what Paul was talking about, like bigger companies, much more ubiquitous in distribution. In terms of grape growing, so there's kind of a divide between Oregon, the Willamette, and Southern Oregon. Southern Oregon, because as I mentioned, it's much more towards, very close to California where the grapes are grown. They're growing Cabernet, they're growing Tempranillo. In the Willamette, it's predominantly, there's some Chardonnay. Chardonnay got off on the wrong foot, if you will, in the Willamette because they planted the wrong rootstocks and clones, but that's kind of been rectified. But it's still predominantly Pinot Noir. Washington State, it's Cabernet and Merlot, right, and a lot of Syrah. But what's interesting, and a lot of people don't know this, there's a big project up in Washington State. There were, I want to say it was 1,000 acres of Pinot Noir that were just planted. And it's in the northern portion of Columbia Valley. So it's going to be a little colder, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. The biggest difference I find is Washington has a hard time connecting with the consumer. So, Woodinville is closer to the Seattle area, but, when I'm out, kind of working Oregon and Washington, what's interesting is most of the vineyards all the vineyards we source from, you're 3.5 hours from Seattle. And you're not going into like a Sonoma or a Napa Valley environment. It's agrarian. I mean, you smell more cow manure than you do grapevine. I'll leave it at that. And so it's not very tourist friendly, if you will, whereas Oregon is very tourist friendly. In terms of California by far is most commercialized. It's much more of a business. For example, when I have a fruit contract in California, it's typically there's an attorney involved. And I'm not diminishing attorneys, but I mean, it's very legitimate. In Oregon, it's a handshake. Washington State is somewhere in between Oregon and California in terms of their business, if that makes sense. But I would strongly promote, again, I produce wines in California, but I would strongly promote looking for smaller producers in any of the 3 states, because I think that's where you truly get, it may be a little more expensive, but from a price quality perspective, you're getting far better ingredients. And hopefully that kind of answers your question.
So earlier you mentioned that you've yet to find the perfect bottle of wine. So when you're out looking for a bottle of wine, what is it that you look for?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we talked about this earlier, and this is why I love these Zoom chats. The questions seem to always be better on these Zoom chats than they are in like live tastings, which I love. Wine is contextual to me, and that's what I was explaining right when I first kind of got on the call before you all joined. Meaning, like, if you're on the beach and you're on vacation and you're drinking that bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, that Sauvignon Blanc tastes better because you're on the beach and you're on vacation, right? And if you're with friends, and obviously if they're friends, they're individuals that you enjoy their company, that bottle of wine tastes better. As far as me, my favorite varietal is Noir. And for me, it would ultimately probably be some Burgundy, right? And don't get me wrong, I think Willamette Valley, I think the Pinot Noir is just phenomenal. But I think it would be some type of Burgundy, and it would be in context where, it's a pretty sunny afternoon out on a patio type of thing. And I do think that context matters. I would also say contextually, like I'll give you an example. I don't even know if this wine's even in the state of Iowa. It's small production, but unfortunately the importer I think is pretty big. So it gets lost in translation. But in the Veneto, when I lived over in Europe, there was a elderly man, just the kindest, gentle Italian man. Granted, I didn't speak Italian, but I was with a friend of mine who worked for the same company who did. And he invited us to his winery. It's called Del Forno. And he makes Ripassos, Valpolicellas, Amarones. And, a very small winery. The whole place may have been 2,000 square feet or something. And with that being said, at that time, he was probably closer to 80 as opposed to closer to 70. And he sat down and he tasted these wines and he's all proud of them. And, Del Forno, if you buy a bottle now, they're in the United States, it's anywhere from $150 to $350. And, like I said, just because I'm in the wine business doesn't mean I'm wealthy, but if I find that bottle of wine as I'm traveling throughout the country, I will buy it, because now I think of sitting down and that nice man taking the time, you know, for this loud American and tasting wine with me. So the wine is absolutely phenomenal as well, but I think contextually, that's what makes wine taste good for me as well.
Thank you. Good response.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers it.
Absolutely.
So I know a little bit about, well, a lot of it about New Zealand Pinot Noirs. Do you see a lot more New Zealand Pinot Noirs kind of coming into the American market? Because right now it's almost impossible to find some except for a couple. But that's kind of one of the areas that I've really enjoyed, along with, because the New Zealand Pinot Noirs are very similar to Oregon Pinot Noirs in flavor profiles. So what kind of do you see with those two?
To answer your question, just like the homogenization in California, which, you know, Chardonnay being ubiquitous, right, and Cabernet being ubiquitous, in not in terms of just sales and marketing, but in terms of production. As you know, New Zealand now is really known for Sauvignon Blanc. Because of that, Pinot Noir has lost, I think, some of the interest in terms of exporting it. And it also, in terms of economics, I don't think there's been a lot of investment in Pinot Noir, and unfortunately so. So I think, unfortunately, Cheyenne, to answer your question, you're going to have to continue to kind of seek it out as opposed to be able to stumble upon it, if that makes sense. But I agree with you. If you recall, I was talking about, you know, growing degree days and climate and diurnal swing. Well, New Zealand's pretty darn cold, right? And so it's really on that region 1 scale or sub-region 1, and that's why it's awesome for Pinot Noir. So to your point, I agree with you. I do think that they would be much more similar in quality to Oregon versus California all day long and twice on Sunday.
Well, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions that you think of and you didn't ask, or as you're drinking the wines and questions, please send me an email via my email or Facebook, and I have a direct link to Gene that I can get him the questions, and I'm sure he would have no problem answering them for you. This was super fun, Gene. Thank you. Very informative, and I think I can for all of us that we had a very fun evening. So thank you very much. Let's all give Gene a big cheers.
Salute.
Thank you. You guys have a great rest of your Saturday. Feel free to reach out to Katie and I. You know, we're so small. If you get on our website, if you send us an email, it's either Kate or I that answers.
Well, thank you very much. We truly appreciate your time, Gene, and we look forward to continuing to build a relationship with you. So thank you.
You guys have a great night.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.